Everyone, and thank you for joining United Solar Energy Supporters, or USES, for its fourth webinar entitled How Solar Can Benefit New York Communities. Before we jump into things, I'd like to quickly introduce USES' mission of building public support for solar projects of all sizes. Our efforts will help promote clean, emission-free power by distributing facts about solar technology. USES represents a wide range of stakeholders, including farmers, grassroots organizations, youth groups, educational institutions, labor groups, families, and businesses who help want to achieve this. The time for positive change has never been more apparent as we face economic impacts of COVID-19 throughout the state. A recent report for the New York State Division of Budget shows the total loss to the New York State economy will be $243 billion over the full recovery period expected to end in Q1 of 2023, which is equivalent to roughly 14% of New York State 2019 GDP. New York State has yet to receive any funding to mitigate this loss, and projections with federal assistance still show significant gaps. So what does this mean for communities and for you and me? These budget shortfalls are likely to affect many aspects of our life, as evidenced with my personal example. My mom is an elementary school teacher in Niagara County, and she was told that she has to use her school supplies from this past year for the coming year, amongst many other budget cuts that they'll be facing. And that's just a small example that you can imagine is replicated and reproduced throughout the state. To remedy this, solar projects offer dollars and jobs coming into communities through solar development. And it's imperative that our communities are educated to make the most of the development in post-COVID-19 economic recovery. And today we begin to do so with our presentation. First, we will have our presentation from our developers, Kevin Campbell, Kate Millar, and Rikki Cason. And throughout our presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A function to put your questions in at any time. And if we don't get to them after the presentations, we'll make sure to get to them following the presentation in an email. And today's recording will also be available after the presentation for your viewing. So we'll get it started today with Kevin. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Haylee, and thanks for everyone who has taken time out of their lunch to join this presentation. And I'm happy to be here today to help share how solar can benefit New York communities, along with Kate Millar and Rikki Cason as well, and we're all developing our own projects for our own renewable energy companies throughout New York State. So my topics, I was going to talk about pilots and host community benefits. Kate's going to talk about the principles of solar siting, and Rikki's going to talk about public engagement. So first off, how can the solar projects that we're developing in communities benefit those communities? And generally speaking, so we're going to talk to you here from a larger solar project perspective, oftentimes maybe over 20 megawatts or in the hundreds of megawatts, 100, 200 megawatt projects that would use 1,000 or more acres of land, for example. So the benefits we offer, everyone's heard of pilots, payment in lieu of taxes, which is normally paid to school districts, counties, and towns that host our project. And they're broken off proportionally in the same sort of proportions as your own property taxes would be broken out. So a certain percentage to school districts, a certain percentage to the counties and towns. And so the pilot, basically our projects need to have pilots, because if we didn't have a pilot, our projects would not be economical. The amount of tax we would pay would just be way too high. And that additional revenue that we would need to pay the taxes would actually come from the ratepayers, people paying for the electricity. So it would just effectively drive up the power prices. Second, the host community agreement. So sometimes we want to have a higher proportion of those revenues go to the host communities because they're really the entity that that takes on maybe the biggest burden of these projects. So a lot of our permitting is with the host community. You know, we want some of the benefits, or a lot of the benefits our projects bring to the communities to be to benefit maybe people living closer to the project. And so the host communities or the host towns are sometimes in the best position to do that. And there's also a third option that's being discussed right now, and that's whether or not developers might be able to put money in a pool to help defray electricity costs for people in a project area. So I believe right now there's a consultation happening in New York State to figure out how to help make that happen. And I believe David might talk about that a little bit later in this webinar. So in terms of how much money, we hear a lot about dollars per megawatt that projects set aside for pilots and host community agreements and maybe deferring electricity costs. What does that look like? So NYSERDA has some guidance that indicates pilot payments should be in the range of 1 to 3% of revenues generated by solar electricity. And I'll show you an example of that here on the next slide. But here, just a quick did you know that 100 megawatts solar facility can power more than 20,000 New York homes, just to give a quick fact. So community benefits, a couple things to mention. Number one is when we talk about pilots and host community agreements and deferring people's electricity costs, we're not talking about 3% of our revenues going to pilots and then more money going to host community agreements and then more money going to deferring electricity costs. The position that we're taking is typically that 3% of revenues should be divided between the pilot, the host community agreement, and deferring electricity costs as much as possible for our projects to be economical. So in this example, we've got a system size of 100 megawatts, and I'm showing here a fixed tilt example and a tracker example because there's a couple different ways to design solar facilities. Just taking a typical revenue and a typical amount of production that a 100 megawatt facility can generate, the total electricity in megawatt hours per year, 156,000 to 168,000. And again, these numbers are all approximates. The total revenues based on the merchant market prices and the renewable energy credits that we might receive be somewhere around $8 million per year on a 100 megawatt facility, and 3% of that would be about $250,000. And so the dollars per megawatt representative of 3% of our revenues is in the range of $2,500 per year. So just to give a quick example, sometimes you hear developers offering a certain dollar per megawatt hour, and this is really where it comes from. And one point to make here is in some of the communities that we're developing, and again, Kate's going to get into this momentarily, but we are proposing a lot of our facilities on land that's currently being used for agriculture. And just to make a quick comparison, oftentimes with agricultural exemption, what we're seeing is people pay about $35 an acre in taxes. And then if we look at a solar facility paying this $2,500 per megawatt or something similar to that, it's a 10 times higher payment than agriculture with agricultural exemption. And so these pilots for solar really bring a lot more revenues to a community. And this 100 megawatt facility would bring $250,000 or more per year in new revenues to the community. So other benefits from solar or hosting solar in a community, there's significant jobs during construction. And on the last USIS webinar, I was really interested to hear the comment that even though these are temporary jobs during construction, these temporary jobs lead to careers for people in our construction industries. There's guaranteed long-term revenues for landowners leasing the land, and those are typically stable revenues, and the projects might last 20, 30 or more years. And so these landowners would have a guaranteed revenue for that period of time, which is great for them. It's something they can reinvest into their own community, or maybe reinvest in some other land that they have for farming. There's ongoing long-term highly skilled jobs in the technicians and the managers who operate and maintain our facilities. Obviously, there's annual contributions to the local economy through the pilots and host community agreements and deferring electricity costs that we mentioned before. And contributions to special district taxes, if that's applicable in communities, is something that we need to look at as well. And Kate will also talk about co-locating solar and agriculture, which is another potential benefit of our solar facilities. And my last slide here, so why would a community choose to host solar? Again, there's significant new revenues for these communities without burdening local infrastructure. So, a 100 megawatt facility might have 2 full-time workers, maybe 3 full-time employees. And so we're not adding a lot of new children in the schools. We're not needing to build new infrastructure in these towns. And so the dollars they're getting from the pilots and other revenues are really net new revenues. The revenues for the local community increased by 10 times compared to properties with agricultural exemption. And New York State is also committed to significant renewable energy development. So we already know that these types of development will happen in New York State. And right now, it's up to the communities to determine whether they want to host these projects and receive the benefits, or allow other communities to enjoy the benefits that these solar energy projects would otherwise bring. So this was my part, and I'll turn it over to Kate.
Hello, thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Millar. I am a solar developer with Invenergy, working on utility scale projects here in New York. And previous to that, I was in the community solar space. But today my slides are gonna touch on the logic that we employ when selecting sites for utility scale solar, and I'll get into some benefits to the agricultural communities. The first thing that we look at when we're looking at a site is the transmission infrastructure and the capacity that lines have to basically accept our electrons. And this blue map here at the bottom of the slide shows the main high voltage transmission corridors in the state. So you can see that the routes that these power lines take is not everywhere throughout the state. It's not as easy as flipping a switch in New York City and sending upstate solar electrons down there. There's a very constrained and set path that these projects can interconnect into. So that's the first piece, and you can kind of see that Western New York is not too full with transmission lines. We look at topography, we look at the current and the future land use. Is this going to be a future shopping plaza or a gas station? Is this a forested area that we don't want to deforest? Is there a presence of wetlands, flood? What's the view shed? What's the impact to cultural resources, the sensitivity of the site, the history of the site? And we're also engaged, and Rikki will get into this more, but in the local zoning and getting a sense of what their local receptivity is to solar projects. And then of course we're looking at and talking to landowners, gauging interest in leasing land. And so the thing we wanted to underscore here is that utility scale projects by and large take years of study and consultation, ascertaining what the local resources are to protect and preserve, and how to design a project that maximizes potential benefits to the local community. And I like to highlight the project on that previous slide that shows a solar site in Long Island, in one of the most densely residential areas in the state. And that's a 20 megawatt solar project there on Long Island. Sorry, Kevin, you can go, thanks. And so the first thing that I like to contextualize is how much land we're really talking about. As a state, we're talking about deploying a fair bit of solar. And I think that we're all trying to figure out how much it is, when it's going to happen, and how much land it's going to take, because it feels like it's all happening at once. So if we have 34+ million acres of land in New York, and about 7 million of that is cropland, hay, or pasture, so it's agricultural, and we've committed to deploying 16,000 megawatts of solar. If we assume that's all ground mounted, that would take up about 110,000 acres of land, or about less than 0.5% of New York State. So using that as a scale, we can continue. So we're going to get into agriculture and the co-location possibilities of ag. And the reason for this is because solar is, we tend to find solar sited on previously cleared flat land that typically coincides with land that is or has been agricultural. So it's important to you know, kind of center what the agricultural use of the property is. This is also happening because solar leases provide long-term stable revenues to farmers. You know, I think I grew up on a farm. Some of you may have that background. Some of you may be familiar with the current ag economy. It's tumultuous. We're seeing a trend where small farms are consolidating into larger operations. So it's a difficult time to hang on to land right now, especially if you're a medium to small producer. So that's why solar leases are, you know, they're popping up in agricultural communities a lot. So there are a lot of benefits that can be a part of a solar project if proper planning goes into it. So if you're converting temporarily land that's agriculture to solar, it can act as a temporary fallowing or resting of land, similar to CRP. Mr. Kevin mentioned we're talking about 20 to 30 years here before decommissioning occurs. Most of these projects follow, you know, they're now following NISDAM decommissioning standards, which allows land to go back to agriculture after solar. So with solar, we can improve soil health, we can decrease runoff associated with the fertilizer use in a lot of commercial agriculture, and we can increase the biodiversity and provide habitat on site. Solar and ag co-location is being adopted all over the world. You know, I think I think a lot about this because of my background, but as I talk to colleagues all across the country and all across the state, this is something that we're all spending a lot of time on. And co-location can mutually benefit our New York State food production as well as our energy goals as a whole. You can keep going. So the primary co-location strategy that you're seeing nowadays is sheep grazing. It's something that has been successfully used all over the state, including in New York. A couple of the community solar projects I worked on use sheep to maintain the vegetation underneath. And why this is so appealing is because sheep work really well on a solar array. They can get underneath the array, they can manage the grass underneath the racking, whereas a mower or larger mammals couldn't as well. It's the grazing contracts where you're paying a local farmer to keep their sheep on site gives another opportunity to diversify revenues. And as a country and as a state, we're importing oodles of lamb, that's primarily from Australia and New Zealand. So it represents an opportunity for us to be bringing a focus back to producing that commodity here in New York. And if you put in the right kind of planning when developing a solar project, planning for solar grazing, you're going to think about fencing, you're going to think about stuff pertaining to water on site, and you're going to think about your seed mixes so that you're providing enough forage for the animals. But those are pretty low barrier to entry things to think about upfront. And then of course, if you're not mowing and you're not weed whacking, you're overall reducing your fossil fuel usage while operating your solar site. And overall, it's in line with encouraging biodiversity on site, but more importantly, keeping the connection between local farmers and the agricultural land long term. And this is a topic that could occupy many, many slides, but pollinators is an important piece to touch on in terms of benefit both to the land itself that the solar is located on and to the regional area, especially in an ag area. Properly planning a solar site to provide for habitat and provide for pollinator forage and habitat is really important. If you're planting the right kinds of plants, you're going to have more pollinators healthy on site, which can increase agricultural yields and the health of the bee population in the surrounding area. And why that's important, if you look at the map here, you can see California in dark green is one of the most pollinator dependent ag communities in the US, but New York and Pennsylvania and a couple other states fall right behind that in terms of crop dependency. So having pollinator habitat is really important, and as many of you probably know, pollinators are in decline. So providing that is a good thing to think about up front. And importantly, if you've got managed pollinators in an ag setting, this can increase your ag yields. There's been studies done that 18 to 40% increase on soybean yields with managed pollinators on site. 23% of our ag production in the US comes from pollinator dependent crops, and 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we take is pollinator dependent. So there's a little graph here that's maybe a little fuzzy, but on the right, it shows what the current production is with row crop soy and corn. In the middle, it shows conventional solar and the increase in revenue. Of course, most of that is coming from a solar lease, but you're seeing the social benefit of carbon. And then to the right, to the left, you're going to see an increased crop yield from pollinator presence. And why I highlighted this is because it's not just a benefit to that field where the solar is located itself, it's a benefit to the community as a whole. And if your neighbor perhaps didn't lease their land to solar, but they've got soybeans and you've got pollinators on site, it could be a mutually beneficial situation.
So public engagement, I'm Rikki Cason. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for Cypress Creek Renewables. And so I'm going to be talking about public engagement in local communities. There's many ways that a developer, when they go into an area, can choose to interact with the community. One way is a community office. This is a place where residents can know every week that there's certain office hours. They can come in, they can learn about the project, or they can come in to ask questions in person. We also hold various open houses and community meetings to hear from residents, to have them learn about different stages of the project. We have one-on-one kitchen table type meetings. There's attendance at local government meetings where we go and we listen and can hear different questions from people that they might have at a government setting. We send out news updates via email. You have our website, social media, so there's different ways to interact that way. There's webinars and other educational opportunities such as this. And then another way is property walks with residents, where we would go to a concerned resident's a house and kind of see for ourselves what their concerns are. One thing is a good neighbor commitment. Not, solar projects are not one size fits all. All projects are different. So developers, they seek to establish sustainable relationships with communities where their projects are located. We want to come in and kind of see what's important to that community and how we can, enhance their needs and benefit them. Some of the ways that developer could connect with local areas are through STEM education. That could include donating a single panel to a group of STEM students, where every day they could go and monitor that panel and see the energy that is generated. Or you could even donate, several panels for a school in the area for the roofs, so they could generate electricity that way. Other community investments and veterans initiative. Another important area is workforce development, so that you can engage, with local schools, colleges, or workforce programs, so that developers can help prepare local workforce for careers and job opportunities in renewable energies and other new sectors, as solar continues to grow. You can go to the next slide. Visual buffering is also an important part. When we pick a location, solar farms by nature, they have a low profile. And so developers, they do try and make every effort they can to keep the existing vegetation around the perimeter of the project. That's not always possible all the way around. So in that case, it's, the goal is to create visual interest around a solar project and create a native habitat for animals. So when we do this, we want to talk to local community leaders. We want input from residents to see what vegetation grows best in that area and find ways that we can, make it visually appealing when they drive by and find ways to best, incorporate the surrounding landscape. Similar with the work with pollinators, visual buffering can also establish, healthy environmental conditions on site. It can create shade for local wildlife, air purification, and erosion control. This is a good example showing a project that was actually in North Carolina, but it shows this project used a lot of the existing trees so that the visual buffering, it kept what was already there, and there's just a small area that that has the road on it. And then this is an example of it's a simulation of what a solar project that was just developed with the fence and no visual buffering. And then this shows what it would look like after the planning and about 5 to 7 years of growth. So this is a great example to show, before you could see the panels when you were driving by, but as the years go on, slowly the trees will start to grow, and then it just blends into the background.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin, Kate, and Rikki. I think it's really important to hear the many, many considerations that go into one of these projects from your all point of view, that there is quite a bit that goes into it. And so I appreciate your time for that. And next we'll have Daniel Spitzer from Hodgson and Russ.
Hello. Let's see, that's a blank screen. That's not the plan. There we go. Everybody can hopefully see it now. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Spitzer from Hodgson Russ, co-leader of our renewable energy practice. And it's a pleasure to be back on the USIS webinar. A lot of interesting things going on with host community agreements. I wanted to talk through some of the examples of host community agreements, some of the considerations that communities have as they put them in place. You heard a lot of great benefits that these projects produce. Some of those are within host agreements, so those are part of the projects. A project comes into town, you have to look at it holistically, look at just as you would look in a seeker review at both the benefits and the costs. So do you when you look at a host community agreement. And a lot of the things that come in, helping farmers to stay in business, job training, all those kind of things that were mentioned that are available things, are benefits that don't always show up in the agreements, but they're important aspects of what projects bring. But I want to talk specifically about the kind of agreements that we've done. So large-scale developments in New York have a long history of providing community benefit agreements. In fact, there is no large-scale development in New York for renewable energy that doesn't have a pilot or a host community agreement of some type. The kind of projects that have had host community agreements and host community agreements in particular, landfills, mines, arenas, mega churches. The Barclays Center, which was an arena plus development, has a $100 million community benefit agreement involving job training, jobs, a whole host of other benefits. There's basically two types of benefits that can be provided: money and everything else. And the finances generally come along in two forms. If you have a payment in lieu of taxes agreement, this was, as mentioned, is shared based on taxes usually. There's two ways that you can get into a pilot agreement: under the real property tax law, section 487 exemption, or if exemption or other benefits are provided through an industrial development agency. And pilots under state law must be shared equally based on tax rates unless jurisdictions agree otherwise. As Kevin mentioned, host community agreements can be unique to each jurisdiction. So we have host community benefit agreements with schools. We have host community benefit agreements with towns. The town agreements often include things related to roads and other aspects of them. And there's a lot of variety that can go into host agreements. And it's a way for communities to do things that they can't necessarily do with tax dollars. New York is what's known as a Dillon state. A Dillon state is a rule that means that unless the New York State legislature has given you permission to do something, you can't do it. With funding that comes from outside of that, or if other folks do it for you, you can expand the range of public services and public benefits that can be provided. So when we talk about this, the one thing we have to deal with is the tax cap problem. New York has a tax cap which affects how much communities can spend: schools, counties, towns, villages. and host community agreements and pilot payments are generally counted against the tax cap revenue limits. Now that means that it's always going to benefit taxpayers because it reduces taxes because the level of revenue doesn't go up. And in some of the large wind projects, for example, it's completely wiped out the local taxes at the town level. Solar does not produce the same kind of capacity that wind does, so the dollar amounts are not the same, but there is an ability to use the money to reduce the tax burden, particularly on farmers in agricultural communities. But very large projects, while they have that benefit, host community agreements can also do a number of things. They can carry out environmental benefits. They, if the host community agreement doesn't involve the municipality at all, it doesn't necessarily deal with the tax cap issue. So, for example, if you have a program where you're providing funding for a particular activity, if it doesn't flow through the town, unless the auditor thinks it was really a case of trying to avoid the tax cap, you're not going to have a tax cap problem. But if you're providing environmental benefits, like helping to restore property, then it's simply not a tax cap issue and won't trigger those issues. And that's an increase of real wealth in the community. There's some legislation that's being proposed that would support exempting renewable energy projects from the tax cap. So schools and municipalities have the choice to use funding to reduce taxes or increase services. And that obviously would provide a real incentive for local communities to support state energy goals. I hope those municipal officials and other taxpayers on this phone will, webinar call, will get behind that legislation if it's introduced, because it really is an issue that communities deal with. And because the revenues that come into a tax cap can actually, when the funding stops, create a tax cap gap for school districts, it's actually created some issues. There's lots of ways of getting around that, though, in terms of the way we structure payments to avoid a tax cap hit. So even if you go put the money against the tax cap, the arrangements can be set up both with pilots and with host community agreements to minimize that tax cap hit. One of the things that I want to talk about is a method that's gotten a lot of press is the bill credits, and that's now been authorized. Bill crediting, Hodgson Russ put in place the first bill crediting project in the state about a decade ago. When the Robert Moses power plant was relicensed, the New York Power Authority offered each of the host communities megawatt block of power. And the town of Lewiston didn't really have a lot of need for this. Town of Lewiston also doesn't have local taxes at that time. And so what we did was we entered into a three-way agreement between the Power Authority, National Grid, and the town, where there was a bill crediting arrangement. The Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Act includes bill crediting as a specifically approved host community agreement method and directs the Public Service Commission to implement it. And I think it was mentioned earlier that that proceeding is now underway. And if that payment goes directly from the company to the utility, there should be no tax cap issues. It benefits whichever class of ratepayers is set up to benefit from it. But developers have also offered in some projects additional discounts to town residents, or offered the first right to sign up for community solar. There's a pot of money that's available to assist in a community, and developers want to spend it in the way that's best for the community. It's not a bottomless pot. You can't keep asking for various things and expect the project's going to be financially viable, but it is a situation where the developer has an absolute interest in making sure whatever benefits are provided in a way that the community wants. And so, for example, recent efforts by the agricultural department to mandate that certain projects provide funding to private groups for conservation easements on other properties, while making no sense at all, because solar gets along very well with farmland and actually preserves farmland. But that money, if you are forced to pay it, is money that's basically being taken away from the community, because it's going oftentimes elsewhere in the county. The rules that Ag and Markets, is to the extent they have any rules talking about, are that the money must be spent within the county. To the extent the project has to spend money on that, that's less money they can spend on you. So it's important that all the entities align to support the host communities, which is where the impacts are. I just want to give you a few quick examples of HCAs, and then we can move to answering questions about how to set these up and some good ways to do it. We've done host community agreements with schools for scholarship funds. We've provided extra funding for environmental monitors over and above what's been required by the law for projects, because the town had a concern about another project that was going on. So we actually paid for an environmental monitor to look at the additional project. We've done park improvements. While a large construction entities in town, sometimes it's easy to do some park improvements. We've built improvements to municipal buildings. We've entered into agreements with SHPO to clean up cemeteries. If there's a cemetery in your town and it's been abandoned, the town's responsible for it. So we've entered into another agreements with SHPO where we provide money to provide that benefit. We have local hiring practices built into some HCAs. To the extent allowable under New York law, we allow, we require that the first preference be given. This is particularly important for things like local trucking companies and other local suppliers. I think Kate mentioned a lot of the kind of things, money that's spent in the community. Typical solar project will spend 7 figures, even small projects in the community, acquiring supplies, housing workers, and those are all benefits that you can put local preferences into the host agreement. We did projects in Erie County that had job training opportunities built in to the agreement. We've sponsored farmers markets. We've done habitat restoration. Again, developers have a budget for what a project can afford, and communities should identify their goal. The new Article 94C specifically requires that type of outreach by developers to the communities. The developers have a real incentive under 94C to work with communities, because whether or not a community supports a project is a factor in terms of how the process lays out. So the developers are there to be long-term good citizens, and that's something that you can work with to with the community to with the developers to create agreements that satisfy community needs. With that, I'll turn it over to Haylee for question and answers.
Thank you so much for that, Dan. I think it's really important to hear that there's a number of options available for communities, that they're not stuck in one route, and that it's up to them to work with the developer to figure those options out. So now we have David Alicea from the Sierra Club here to share with us a little bit more on the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth Act and the public service comment period happening. So thank you, David. David, are you muted?
I am muted, thank you. Now I went, okay. So my name is David Alicea. I'm Sierra Club's New York lead organizing representative. I live in Wayne County, outside of Rochester, and I work with our members and supporters across Western New York, many of whom live in communities where renewable energy projects are currently proposed. And so we've been working to engage the wider community, town officials, and the state to try and make sure that these projects happen. As you can imagine, as an environmental group, we're very concerned about climate change and want to see more renewable energy. But we also live in the Rochester area, and anyone knows Rochester, you know, we had companies like Xerox and Kodak that are really now just shells of themselves. And I think we're doing an okay job trying to chart our way forward economically. But I think we really want to make sure that we take advantage of this renewable energy opportunity to really grow our communities, to strengthen our community, to provide people with good jobs and good schools, to help chart our way forward in the future. So I am here to talk a little bit about a public service commission proceeding that is happening. So I want to provide some context for that. There was a major law passed in early April that many of you likely know about that changed the rules on siting a bit. If you haven't seen it, there was a webinar actually that we hosted maybe a month or two ago. You can go to the United Solar Energy Supporters website to take a look if you haven't. But really quickly, in that law, one of the things it did was it instructed the Public Service Commission to start a proceeding within 60 days to offer a discount or credit on utility bills for communities hosting renewable energy projects. And just to clarify for some people, because I've had a lot of questions around this, there is a process through New York State Energy Research Development Authority for these build-ready programs where they're going to dig in on pilots and host community benefit agreements, and the state's going to be very involved in that. Most of the projects that you know of right now, and most of the projects moving forward where you have private developers, and they're not in that build-ready program, they will continue to negotiate the payment in lieu of taxes, the host community benefit agreements, all the things that Dan Spitzer just talked about. That will all continue to happen, and this has been a little bit of a point of confusion that I wanted to clarify with people. So who is the Public Service Commission? Public Service Commission regulates private or investor-owned utilities. They're the same thing, people use different terms. So these are your electric utilities, your gas utilities, water, telecom, anything that has normally a monopoly. As a state, we've said you're allowed to have a monopoly, but we're gonna set some rules for you. Public Service Commission typically deals with rates. All these companies have to go to the commission to set rates. They have set our renewable energy targets. They deal with funding to programs. So a lot of our energy efficiency work, some of our community solar, they've set the rules for how this works. But they do have limited power. So the other community benefits, like they don't have just carte blanche jurisdiction over that. There's other agencies that have it. And there's still a great deference for home rule when it comes to negotiating host community benefit agreements and pilot agreements in the state. The PSC is limited in sort of what they can tackle given this. So they started this proceeding to look at community benefits and how they could structure some type of bill discount or environmental benefit. I wish it was simple as just Oprah giving cars to everybody. It's not that simple. The Public Services Commission doesn't just get to hand out discounts. But they've asked a number of questions to the public in their beginning of their proceeding. They've asked whether it should be a bill discount or environmental benefit. It's a very ill-defined term that we've been pondering about. They've asked if it should be a one-time discount or a multi-year discount. They've asked about who should it cover. Should it be people who live closest to a renewable energy project? Should it be everyone in a town that has a project in their community? Is it all the customers, so industrial, businesses, or is it just homeowners, residential customers? And also the financial implications. How large should that discount be? How do we calculate it? They just threw everything out there. This is the very beginning of a process, and so they're just mapping it all out. And these questions, as you can tell, are very basic questions to how you structure this benefit. So Sierra Club has spent some time with a number of organizations and also in consultation with some towns that we have worked with, some counties that we've worked with, some other key people to try and come up with a preliminary set of talking points into this proceeding. Some basic things that we want to put into we're putting into our formal comments and that we're asking people to put in. First is to identify additional funding sources for community benefits. So currently, as the legislation writes out, this is a developer paid fund. And so as was stated earlier, there's only so much money to go around. Even if you think you can, your town, you think you can negotiate a better deal than what was just laid out. At the end of the day, there's a certain amount of money that a developer has to spend. There's just only so much they can do. We think that communities that are hosting renewable energy projects are doing a service to everybody in the state. And so we want the state to look at, is there an opportunity to do an automatic bill discount using other funds? Is there an opportunity to do guaranteed energy efficiency upgrades in the community so people are using less energy? How do we target existing money that is out there and being used to really help communities that are hosting renewable energy projects? There are going to be some developer paid funds from this, is sort of our take on it. We believe that if a town is able to negotiate directly with a developer on a host community benefit agreement, and they decide we want to build, the best ballpark in the world, and we don't need this electric rate discount, that doesn't really fit our needs or our priorities, they should be able to do that and opt out of the bill discount if they can negotiate something that fits fits their community better. Along with that, we really felt, we rated the pros and cons of who should be eligible and really felt like the town should decide that. And so given that every town is different, and so maybe in one town they want to really give the benefit to the people who live closest to the project because that makes sense, and that would maximize the percentage of a discount they would get and the total dollar amount they would get. In other places, it may make sense to spread it around. Maybe the project, it really encompasses, has an impact on the town as a whole, and you want to spread out that benefit. And finally, for some of our downstate folks, as I mentioned, the Public Service Commission only regulates private utilities. We have large public utilities, including the Long Island Power Authority. The law instructs that LIPA must establish a similar program, but we really want to make sure that the Public Service Commission is talking to the Long Island Power Authority now, so that they're establishing something that's uniform, that's fair to towns, no matter where you are in the state, and fair to developers, no matter where you are in the state. 2 points that I also wanted to share. We believe this is outside the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission, but something I'm continually hearing from local communities is that there needs to be more guidance for pilot payments and community benefit agreements, more examples of what other communities have done, more guidance on how to structure this. We think the state can step up and offer some of that. Also more upfront assistance for communities to manage renewable energy siting. And so that could be more money to pay for attorneys early on in the process, so they can develop, they can write the siting laws, they can figure that out. The Public Service Commission will not rule on this, but the Public Service Commission works very closely with the governor's office, with other state agencies, and we think this is an important opportunity to raise these concerns, even if we know the commission may not actually be able to tackle this. So the comment period ends on July 3rd for this. So if you liked these comments, you can actually go to the uses webpage. The link right on the front of the page takes you to a place where you can make a pre-made comment. It also has a Word document. So if you only liked some of these points or want to expand on them, you can download that Word document, follow the instructions, submit your own comment. I do know that deadline is soon. So what I will say is the Public Service Commission doesn't have very firm deadlines. They're not going to be working on July 4th, responding to every comment and incorporating their law. So if you do it a week late, the Public Service Commission will still accept your comment. They will still take it into consideration. And this is also the beginning of the process. There are likely going to be additional comment periods and processes. So if you're not quite sure how to wrap your head around it today, know that there will be more opportunities for action in the future moving forward. And so that is all I had. I think it's time for questions.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that. And we are running just a slight bit over, so we have 10 roughly minutes or so for question and answer today. And so some of the questions had already been answered in Dan and David's presentation that were asked a bit earlier on. But just to start off, I'd like to ask Kevin, Kate, and Rikki, if you could just describe a little bit more of the process that goes into the wildlife migration studies and glare considerations as well.
Sure, I can take that one. So for a typical project going through a permitting process, our projects would undergo wildlife studies. We typically are doing a site characterization study to ascertain what species are on site, and of a special note, which threatened and endangered species are present, and if they are getting into dialogue with DEC about that and about avoiding certain areas or not. It really depends on the species. Some of our projects, like there was one shown on the first slide of my section on the project on Long Island that has wildlife corridors cut into the fence. They're like mammal-sized notches cut out of the fence. So there are some design considerations that can be given depending on what area you're in and what species you're trying to provide corridors or special consideration for. And then the second question was about glare and glint. So we typically will do, most projects will do a glare study, and that examines a variety of viewpoints, homes, roads. It'll typically pick a stationary point on a road as well as a moving point, and examine how many minutes a typical point might experience in terms of glare and glint, and they rank that between, it's green, yellow, and red, but level of severity. And we're finding that on our single axis tracker projects, we're seeing little to no glare or glint because of the direction of the panels in relationship to the location of the sun in the sky. But it is something that goes into an Article 10 application and is usually required in a seeker process. And those are quite commonplace now to produce.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
This one is going to be for Dan. If you could just clarify this for me a bit. I believe that there are different limitations for local hiring for sightings, whether it's community or utility scale projects. Could you just touch on that a little bit for local hiring and materials sourced for these projects?
So almost all these projects are prevailing wage projects. I'm not aware of any that are not. In fact, NYSERDA requires it if there's NYSERDA funding involved, if that's what if we're referring to. In terms of hiring requirements, I'm not a labor lawyer, so I'm not sure of anything specific. Most of the folks work with the local building trades to whoever they bid out to the various companies who are their EPC contractors. I'll let one of the developers fill in otherwise. Where we usually see local preferences is that we have a lot of subsidiary companies like trucking companies and services like that, and we'll write into the agreements that will ask the company to focus on those sources and try to hire local residents. We'll ask companies to hold a local hiring hall or set up a website for folks to apply for the jobs. But there's no difference between the small scale and the large scale, except that the large scale projects create a lot more jobs. And I'll ask the developers to correct me if I'm incorrect on that, but that's my understanding in terms of there's no other differences between them. It's not size dependent, but rather locale dependent. And again, the developers want to hire the local people. They want the local people to get the money. So it usually works out pretty well. And I'll defer to Kevin and Rikki and Kate if there's anything else.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I could add there is typically when we have a construction company selected and before we start construction, we'd ask that company to have a local public meeting of their own so that they can learn more about and meet more of the local providers and people will be looking for work so that they're part of the Rolodex and part of the people considered to staff the various positions or provide the various materials for the job. But it's like you said, Dan, we definitely try to keep the benefits local where possible.
Thank you for that. My next question is for David. This question poses that the host community benefit idea has the potential to create winner and loser communities depending on existing transmission and land resources in that said municipality. So they're wondering, what are some methods to level out this disparity and benefit environmental justice communities and low to moderate income customers?
Yeah, that's a very large question. And so I think the important thing is under the state's climate law, there's a goal of getting 40% of the benefit of our clean energy programs towards disadvantaged communities. And so this is one program within a larger scope of actions the state is taking. Some of the ideas that we are looking at, for example, when we were in our comments for additional funding sources for community benefits, we have working on the exact wording in our formal comments, but we're asking for special attention to be paid to disadvantaged communities and maybe an additional funding mechanism for disadvantaged communities to receive a larger discount for that. There's also a state proceeding happening on transmission to figure out what kind of transmission upgrades are we doing in our electric system as a whole, which will likely impact future renewable energy development. I think there's probably a lens of how will that benefit environmental justice and low to moderate income customers in the long term. At the very beginning, so I'm not sure how that will shake out or even how to do that. And then, of course, things like community solar and other programs are going to help round out that benefit of our transition to clean energy.
Thank you for that, David. I have a question that I think kind of flows off of that for, I believe Kate was mentioning some co-location. So for developers that co-locate sheep with their arrays, how do they deal with the management of the animals during the winter months?
Yeah, so most of the models I've seen and been a part of is that the solar developer contracts with a solar or a sheep farmer, so the solar grazer, or a few of them, if in the case may be. And those grazers usually pull the animals off in the late fall, so they're not on site during the winter. They usually have a home barn or a home farm that those go back to.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question now for David and Dan on host community agreements and the bill credit program. And that, do you think it is a viable option for the host community agreements and or the bill credit program to be expanded to replace the extraneous funding being requested in certain other circumstances? And they're calling that extraneous funding conservation easement funding. Could this conservation easement funding be bundled into host community agreements negotiated directly with towns and counties?
The answer is yes, if we get an adult in the room to get the state agencies to cooperate with each other. You know, I'm hopeful that the ORS process, more than the 94C, more than the Article 10 has been, is going to be look at this more holistically and not allow state agencies to be creating, particularly with solar, imposing costs on projects that are in effect draining what could be provided to the communities. I mean, the answer is yes. At the end of the day, whatever the state imposes on you, whether it's ag and markets or whoever, that reduces the funds that developers have available. But once you get that number, it becomes a negotiation with the various people, with the counties, with everyone as to what you can do. And it won't surprise you to know that not everybody's always in agreement, particularly over the allocation of funding. But it generally gets worked out, and projects have been built that have really helped a lot of things. But again, it's a matter of the more these, we'll just go do this, we'll just go do that, are added on by the state agencies, the less the projects have to share with the local communities. David?
I think that's spot on.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank you all for your time. I know there are a few questions in the Q&A we didn't get to, but we are out of time today, and we will get to those in the recording following the webinar as well. So thank you all for your time today, and please feel free to follow up if you have additional questions as well. Thank you.